On a world map, the oceans appear open, vast, and almost infinite. Yet the global economy does not depend on the size of those oceans, but on the bottlenecks that cut through them. These are the narrow passages where ships carrying oil, food, minerals, electronics, and everyday goods must pass, often with no real alternative route. The Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Strait of Malacca, the Bosphorus, the Bab el-Mandeb, all small places on the map, but with enormous consequences for world prices. What most people never realize is that every time one of these choke points slows down or closes, the effects show up in daily life. They appear at the gas station, in the supermarket, and even in the broader inflation rate. Today, these choke points are under growing pressure from conflict, climate stress, drought, and geopolitical rivalry. Because the global economy is more interconnected than ever, a disruption in one region can ripple across continents within days. In this report, we explore how choke points actually work, why the world depends so heavily on them, and what could happen if the places that keep global trade moving suddenly stop. Right now, many of the world's key choke points are experiencing heightened strain. In the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb, conflicts and attacks on commercial shipping have forced vessels to reroute thousands of miles around Africa. This adds days, sometimes weeks, to delivery times and sharply raises transport costs. Because 12 to 15% of global trade normally passes through the Red Sea into the Suez Canal, the impact of these disruptions is immediate and global. The Suez Canal itself faces challenges even in the absence of conflict. Extreme winds, ship groundings, capacity limits, and dependence on a single engineered channel all create vulnerabilities. The canal handles a large share of European and Asian trade, containerized goods, oil and LNG shipments, and automotive components. Any delay here ripples through supply chains in multiple directions at once. The Panama Canal, meanwhile, has been hit by drought conditions that lower water levels and force authorities to reduce ship weight limits, daily transit slots, and overall capacity. Because the Panama Canal connects the Atlantic and Pacific with a single shortcut, every restriction forces shipping companies into difficult choices. They must decide between paying more for constrained passage or sailing thousands of additional kilometers around South America. In the Strait of Hormuz, roughly 1/5 of global oil passes through a narrow passage between Iran and Oman. Tensions in the region, whether military or political, create immediate volatility in energy markets as traders price in the risk of disruption. The Strait of Malacca, the world's busiest shipping lane, is crucial for trade between China, Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, India, and Europe. Any disruption here would affect supply chains spanning everything from electronics to agriculture. Because there is no fully equivalent alternative route, Malacca is one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on Earth. Taken together, these examples point to a single conclusion: the global economy is only as strong as its narrowest corridor. The idea of choke points is not new. They shaped history long before they shaped modern logistics. In ancient times, control of narrow waters meant control of trade. The ancient Greeks depended on key straits for grain imports, while the Romans secured important passageways to ensure both food supplies and military movement. Even then, geographic constraints translated into economic leverage and political power. During the Age of Exploration in the 15th to 18th centuries, when global trade rapidly expanded, choke points became geopolitical prizes. European powers fought for control of the Strait of Malacca, the Cape of Good Hope, the Bosphorus, and the Strait of Gibraltar. Control of a choke point often meant control of an empire's wealth. As industrialization took off, a new era of man-made choke points emerged, reshaping the structure of global trade. Two canal projects in particular transformed the map. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, suddenly connected Europe and Asia by a direct route, shrinking travel times and causing shipping volumes to surge. The Panama Canal, completed in 1914, joined the Atlantic and Pacific, transforming U.S. trade capacity and global logistics. These man-made choke points became essential infrastructure, but also single points of failure. In the 20th and 21st centuries, globalization further increased their importance. As supply chains became lean, efficient, and highly interdependent, the system's dependence on smooth flows through these narrow corridors grew. Factories came to rely on components arriving just in time, with minimal inventory buffers. Energy markets depended on uninterrupted flows of oil and gas. Food importing countries relied on predictable shipping schedules to maintain food security. When efficiency increases, resilience often decreases, and choke points make that vulnerability visible. To understand how these corridors shape the world, we need to look at who depends on them. Governments rely on choke points for energy imports, export revenue, industrial supply chains, and food security. They monitor these routes closely because disruptions can influence inflation, employment, national security, and domestic politics. A blockage or slowdown can quickly become both an economic and political problem. For shipping companies, time and fuel translate directly into money. Rerouting vessels is costly, and delays in major canals like Suez or Panama force firms to choose between higher operating costs, longer routes, lost contracts, or penalties from customers. Their balance sheets reflect the health of these corridors. Energy producers and consumers are equally exposed, since oil and natural gas flow through choke points like arteries. Any risk to those flows, whether real or perceived, influences global oil prices, futures markets, and domestic energy costs. Even countries far from a conflict zone feel the impact at the gas pump when insurance premiums rise or shipping delays occur. Manufacturers and retailers, meanwhile, increasingly stretch supply chains across continents. A missing component stuck behind a bottleneck can halt entire factories producing electronics, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and consumer goods. For families and consumers, choke point disruptions translate into higher shipping costs that become higher prices. Slower deliveries can cause product shortages, while uncertainty in logistics contributes to market volatility. A bottleneck on the other side of the world can turn into inflation in a local supermarket. In this way, the geography of global trade quietly intersects with household budgets. Choke points matter for personal finances because they influence global inflation. When ships are forced to travel longer routes or face repeated delays, fuel costs rise, insurance costs increase, and freight rates climb. These expenses accumulate as goods move from wholesalers to distributors to retailers. Eventually, they land in the price that consumers pay at the checkout. What looks like a distant logistical problem becomes a very local cost of living issue. They also affect energy prices directly. Oil and LNG markets are extremely sensitive to perceived choke point risk. Even the threat of disruption can raise prices because traders anticipate possible shortages. Importers rush to secure supply, and shipping firms adjust routes. Anyone who drives a car, heats a home, or relies on electricity is touched by these dynamics, whether they realize it or not. Choke points influence interest rates and broader financial conditions as well. When supply chains slow down, costs rise, and inflation pressures intensify. Central banks responding to that inflation may keep interest rates higher for longer than they otherwise would. This affects mortgages, credit card rates, business loans, and government borrowing costs. A disruption in a canal can contribute indirectly to changes in loan rates months later. Beyond immediate prices and interest rates, the stability of global trade itself rests on these narrow corridors. If key choke points become militarized, politically contested, heavily impacted by climate stress, or simply overloaded by rising demand, the result could be chronic volatility in shipping. That volatility feeds into uncertain prices, unpredictable delivery times, and higher risk for businesses planning investment and production. Looking ahead, several possible futures stand out. In one scenario, costs rise, but there is no major breakdown. Choke points remain open, but they stay fragile. Disruptions in the Red Sea continue intermittently. Drought-related constraints persist in Panama, and Suez handles growing traffic while experiencing periodic delays. This produces higher baseline shipping costs, occasional inflation spikes, and more cautious central banks. It is not a full-blown crisis, but it is far from stable. In another scenario, a regional conflict triggers a major disruption. Tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, escalation in the Red Sea, a blockade in the Taiwan Strait. Households under this scenario would face higher fuel and food prices, potential shortages, and rising inflation expectations. A third scenario centers on climate stress pushing canals to their limits. Droughts, extreme temperatures, and water scarcity could chronically reduce Panama Canal capacity, pressure operations at the Suez Canal, and increase maintenance and operating expenses. This would force global shipping to rely more heavily on longer maritime routes. Climate change, in this sense, does not just warm the planet, it reshapes the geography and economics of trade. A more optimistic path is one in which the trade system becomes more resilient and diversified. New routes, such as Arctic passages during ice-free seasons, could develop. More regional trade might reduce dependence on long-haul shipping. Disruptions would still occur, but the system would have more flexibility and redundancy. For families, this could mean more stable prices, fewer shortages, and less volatility in energy markets. The world economy is both powerful and fragile, highly efficient, yet deeply exposed. For families, understanding choke points is not primarily about geography. It is about recognizing why inflation sometimes rises suddenly. The next decade will test whether global trade can adapt to the combined pressures of conflict, climate stress, growing demand, and shifting power dynamics. One thing is certain: as long as the world depends on narrow corridors, the stability of global trade and the prices we all pay will depend on what happens inside those fragile lines on the map. Thank you for watching the Atlas Economy Report. If you found this analysis useful, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss our next video. Your support helps us continue creating educational content on global forces, personal finance, and the economics shaping everyday life. We appreciate your time, and we'll see you in the next report.